What's up everybody, I'm Jason and welcome back to the channel. So this video is going to kick off I think it's going to be 4 parts at least, mini-series looking at or debriefing my last trip to Yellowstone National Park. So I'm going to break it into a couple of different videos, largely because of how long they end up being, but I'm going to cover sort of my personal operational debrief. So this is something I tend to do after, well, this whole process is something that I tend to do after any time I do a major photographic or video or whatever field expedition to evaluate what went well, what didn't go well, what I can improve on, how I can improve on it, etc. So I look at pretty much everything from how I performed in terms of dealing with situations, composing, shooting images, how the gear performed. So in part 2, I'm going to be talking about the gear, specifically how my R5 performed, my R5C performed, and how my MacBook Pro M1 performed. This is the first time that I've had any of this equipment really out in the field seriously being used. So there's a number of interesting observations that I have not previously had with this equipment. In part 3, I'm going to talk about trip planning in general to Yellowstone. So this is basically, I'm going to talk about everything that I wish I knew when I was planning my first trip to Yellowstone and some things that I learned from planning this trip to Yellowstone. And then the final part, I'm going to take a look at some photographs that I shot and my thought process behind them and sort of what could be done better, what I could do better in the future. So this part is the first part of this series, and it's basically what I'm calling the operational debrief. So it's basically I am looking at how I performed, what I did well, what I did poorly. But I'm not focusing on, say, specific pictures. I'm focusing more on general how I used or how I performed in the field. I'm going to cover a couple of topics here. I'm going to cover an overview of this trip that I went on and its primary purpose and function and so forth. I'm going to talk a little bit about the situation that's currently evolving in Yellowstone with unprecedented flooding, destroying or damaging significant amounts of park equipment, impacting Yellowstone National Park and the neighboring communities. And then I'm going to finally get to talking about essentially the operational debrief that is the heart of the meat of this video. So before I get into talking about my trip, I want to briefly talk about the situation currently developing in Yellowstone National Park. So unprecedented rain and early snow melt have created a flooding situation in Yellowstone and surrounding communities that has had significant impacts pretty much all over the park and, well, quite honestly, to the communities around the park. In the park itself, and I'm not really going to expand out on the communities because there's a lot to cover and this isn't really what I intended for these videos. But in the park itself, the flooding situation has significantly impacted the the northern part of the park, and specifically the north and northeast entrance roads. These roads have had significant and multiple significant washouts where the road is completely gone. So the current situation as of late June 2022 is that the Park Service has reopened the southern part of the park. So the east entrance, the south entrance, and the west entrance have reopened. People are being allowed into the park. There are some interim access restrictions based on the capacity available in the park due to the damage. Additionally, the Grand Loop Road, or at least the southern half of the Grand Loop Road, and the Norris Canyon Bypass Road are open. So the communities in the park of the Old Faithful Village, Madison, Norris, Canyon Village, Fishing Bridge, Lake Village, West Thumb, and Grant Village, all of those areas are currently open and accessible. This includes the Hayden Valley. However, what's not currently accessible, and it's not at all clear, at least to me, when it will be reopened and made re-accessible, is the northern half of the park. Now, the Grand Loop Road from essentially Norris Junction through Mammoth, through Tower Junction, over Dunraven Pass, and then down into Canyon Village has suffered some impacts, but it's not something that can't be reasonably efficiently or readily cleared, at least based on what I've been able to see. However, those roads are closed at the current time. The north entrance and northeast entrance roads, as I said, suffered some significant washouts. Those will not be able to be reopened this year, if maybe not next year or the following year. It's not at all clear how long it's going to take. There are places where the road is going to have to, the road, the grade, everything is going to have to be completely reconstructed or rerouted in the canyons or in valleys or areas. So one aspect of this, especially for photography, is that while the Hayden Valley is open and the Hayden Valley is accessible and is a very interesting and great spot to photograph things, there's a lot of things going on there. The real sort of gem of the Yellowstone wildlife and to a certain extent landscape photography is the Lamar Valley. And the Lamar Valley is along and accessed by the northeast entrance road, which is currently closed. So not only, and washed out. So not only is it restricted because it's on the part of the park that is currently closed for access, but it's also on a road that has seen significant damage. So there may be an extended period of time in which we will not be able to readily access the Lamar Valley for photographic or any other purposes. Now, of course, this situation is constantly evolving. The Park Service is already working hard to reopen the park, to evaluate what needs to be done to recover and repair from the damage that's been caused in the park, and they are doing their best to provide updates continuously through the National Park Service website for Yellowstone National Park. So if you are planning on visiting Yellowstone, regardless, you should be checking the National Park Service page. If you're not familiar with where that is, you can find it at nps.gov/YELL. So let me start off by making with a quick trip overview kind of thing to put in mind what it is and build my excuse stack a little bit. So I was in Yellowstone National Park essentially, and Grand Teton National Park for that matter, from May 21st to June 2nd of 2022. So I was out there before the flooding impacted roads, but certainly the rain and snow melt that was contributory to the flooding situation was already happening when I was out there, and therefore, I saw sort of the opening rounds, if you will. It just hadn't gotten to a point where the ground saturation and everything was to the point that the water couldn't be handled. So in this trip, I covered pretty much all of Yellowstone National Park and most of Grand Teton National Park, at least from the roads. And the reason that I wasn't doing any camping or backcountry hiking or anything like that came down to the primary intent of this trip, which is sort of the biggest excuse in the excuse stack. So this trip was primarily intended for my dad to experience Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park. When I was out there in 2018 and showed him pictures and video from the park, he expressed interest in seeing the park. At that time, for that trip, and knowing my dad and the way he likes to travel, that trip was certainly a no-go for him because of the pacing that I was working at. However, having the ability to sit down, having been there, having learned lessons that I will talk about in several of these videos, I was able to sit down and organize a trip that was comfortable for him to be able to experience as much of the park at a pace that he would be comfortable with and would be capable of handling and doing and enjoy. So that's how this trip was organized. Now, the compromise that came out of that for me from a photographic perspective is that there were many places where I wasn't doing something that I might otherwise do as a photographer. So, for example, if you're a wildlife photographer, you know that the best opportunities for wildlife photography tend to be in the first 3 and last 3 hours of the day. Now, of course, that also corresponds to when you have the best light. Not only is it good light, but it also means that the animals tend to be more active because it's a bit cooler in the day. So I wasn't out doing that because that wasn't conducive to having making the trip enjoyable for my father. Moreover, there were many situations where I moved expeditiously or more expeditiously than I probably would have otherwise, simply because I know my dad. If the goal is to make it comfortable and enjoyable for him, sitting somewhere for 45 minutes or an hour to see if some potential situation develops or potential images develop that's not completely up his cup of tea or in his wheelhouse, so to speak. And so there were times where I moved on or operated more quickly than I might otherwise have. Now, finally, the weather. And I'm going to talk about that in more detail in a minute, but the weather was pretty consistently bad for the trip from a photographic perspective. Let's move on to the bulk of what I'm going to try to get through reasonably quickly in this video, which is my personal debrief on the operational sort of aspects of how I operated as a photographer in the field. Now, a lot of this stuff is almost certainly going to come off to many of you as duh moments, or how could you be that stupid moments, and quite honestly, in looking at a lot of the stuff, I either thought I wasn't going to do it, ahead of time, or I was prepared to not do it ahead of time, and it turned out that one reason or another, in the heat of the moment, I performed less than admirably. There's a number of aspects here, and I'm going to just run through the big issues that I identified for myself on this trip. So as I said, weather was the first major consideration, and I performed, there was good and bad aspects to this. So this trip really reiterated and underscored to me how weather and good weather aren't givens. Generally, if I'm going to be somewhere for a week or 2 weeks, kind of expect that you're going to have some bad days and you're going to have some good days. And this trip was very narrow or shallow on the good days and very deep on the bad days. So from a weather perspective, we saw temperatures from below freezing, as low as in fact 21 degrees Fahrenheit or about -6 degrees Celsius, all the way to really comfortable temperatures of somewhere in the mid-70s Fahrenheit, 74, 75, or about 23, 24 Celsius. That said, while the temperature was kind of reasonable, we saw pretty much every kind of precipitation that you could get. There was rain, there was hail, there was sleet, and there was snow. And in fact, the first night that we were there in the park, we had 4 inches of snow that night. So being from Florida, I am not accustomed to scraping ice and snow off of a car, but that was necessary to get going the second day. Now, of course, with precipitation comes cloud cover, and for almost the entirety of the trip, we had 60 to 90% or more cloud cover just as a rule. Now, there were afternoons or parts of days where the cloud cover broke and we could see blue skies, then it would fill back in later. And in fact, the entire time that we were in Jackson Hole, which is Grand Teton National Park, the cloud bases were never higher than 8,000 or 9,000 feet, give or take. And other than in a couple of extremely rare exceptions, we couldn't see the tops of the Grand Teton Mountains or the Teton Mountain Range. It would go, if you were at an overlook or whatever, you would have sagebrush meadow to pine trees, foothills to, you could see the base of the mountains to just gray clouds. So there was a couple of things that I ended up taking away from this. On the plus side, I was prepared, at least mechanically, for the situation. So I had proper base layers, I had proper outer layers, I had a soft shell, I had hard shell. I was more than capable of dealing with operating in rain or snow or anything like that. On top of that, I knew the limits that I was comfortable with in taking my camera gear before either just calling it and saying I'm not going to go out and shoot with this, or in this, or put a raincoat on the camera or whatnot. Now, for the R5, my limit is I'm more than fine shooting in snow. I'm more than fine shooting in light rain. The camera is reasonably well weather sealed. The lenses or all my lenses are L lenses. They're reasonably well weather sealed. It's fine for that kinds of things. My R5C, on the other hand, is a bit more limiting. So the exposed cooling meant that I wasn't taking that camera out into rain or snow if beyond the lightest possible snow situation, certainly not into rain. Now, that did result in some instances where I had to change lenses that I otherwise maybe wouldn't have had to do if I was using, because I was using the cameras, dual cameras in a lot of cases, which was a big benefit of the R5C, but I'll talk about that in more detail when I talk about the hardware. The bigger problem for me on this trip was from a, we'll call it, psychological perspective. So I was reasonably well adaptable, or I found I adapted reasonably well to not having the good clear days. Now, obviously, I went out there hoping to get some good clear days. The last time I was in the Tetons, I screwed up a couple of Panos that I shot of the Grand Tetons because I had not fully developed my Pano technique at the time, ended up with some blurry individual images, and as a result, or subframes, whatever you want to call them. And as a result, I have less than perfect panos that I was really hoping to be able to reshoot. Now, mountains don't move so much, so all I needed was some blue skies or reasonably puffy, cloudy skies, and I would have been able to get generally the same kinds of images. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. On top of that, or sort of counter to that, or whatever, on a plus side, there's the word I'm looking for. On a plus side, I was reasonably adaptable to shooting in bad weather. And I think some of this comes simply from the fact that I like shooting in bad weather. I've had more interesting, or more images that I consider to be more interesting come out of rain or snow or some situation like that's not just golden hour, puffy clouds, and perfect light. It's a different kind of image, certainly, but it's something I'm always on the lookout for. Part of that is that I am always looking behind me when I'm in a bad weather situation. So however you tend to want to shoot, or you tend to shoot, you could have perfectly good images or nice skies to one side and a big honking rainstorm on your other side. And when I know that I'm working in bad weather, I will go for the good images that I can get, but I will always turn around and look for an image in the bad weather as well. So that worked out well. What I really wasn't prepared for, at least mentally, and this took a toll in terms of me kicking myself of not exploiting certain situations, is that I was not prepared for the weather to just consistently be bad. So in the past, in my travels, I can't think of or remember a time where I was somewhere for 7 to 14 days and had 7 to 14 days of consistently bad weather. It would always, I always would have some good weather, some bad weather, a little bit of both. And this was a situation where we had, like, we would have a good day or a good afternoon, and for one reason or another, and specifically the one good afternoon that we really had, we were on an evening wildlife viewing tour, And obviously there's some limitations with that. And I'll talk about this tours and whatnot in more detail in the planning a trip video. But the tour imposes limitations in that as I was going back, I was looking out the window of the van going, oh man, the light's great. This would be a great picture. Oh, the light's great here too. This would be an amazing picture. And was telling myself at the time, well, you know, tomorrow we'll be out here on our own. We'll go do this, you know, it should be fine. And then we'll be back in a couple of days anyway, so we can try then and it should be fine. And it turned out that it was not fine. Basically, you know, the weather was not equivalent on the rest of the days that were there. So that really kicked me around a bit, you know, mentally. And I talk about mental side of things, and maybe this is just me, but I've always found that because photography is a creative endeavor, there is a big part of me that has to be excited, enthusiastic about what I'm shooting and what I'm doing. And if I don't feel like I'm making, you know, if I'm not enthusiastic about doing things, I have a tendency to not want to go out and try. Or if I go out, I'm very mechanical about it, and I'm not really into whatever it is that I'm trying to shoot, and it tends to take a toll on the quality of the images. Maybe that's me, maybe that's not, but it's something I noticed reasonably significantly with this trip, more than any trip I've done in the past, in that if I lost sort of the faith that I was going to get anything, it got harder and harder and harder to want to go out and get anything. Or when I went out to try and get things, because after all, if you aren't out shooting, you don't get anything at all, that it became harder and harder to look for or find good images. So that was the weather. Let's move on to some, and that was a big, to me, consideration. But let's move on to some more specific points. So first of all, I have 2 points that relate to filters. In some respects, they both come down to the same thing, but in some respects, they are slightly different lessons, at least to me. So the first one is polarization and water. So Yellowstone National Park is a thermal feature hotspot. There's geysers, hot springs, all kinds of thermal features all over the park. It's the highest concentration, I believe, in thermal features in the world in one area. Shooting those really requires to optimally shoot those using a polarizer. There's a lot of interesting color from the thermophilic bacteria that grow in and around the lake or the water, as well as some incredible blues that the water in these thermal features has, that if that's being masked by glare and doesn't come through in your images, it really puts a damper on how interesting those images are. And the only real way to deal with this, practically speaking, is to use a polarizer when you're shooting in the field. Unfortunately, I spent 2 days shooting various thermal features without a polarizer because I forgot it. I had it with me on the trip. I knew I was going to be shooting thermal features, and in my haste to go shoot something, would leave it in the car and not take it with me or not put it on the lens. And in fact, this got so aggravating to me that I eventually dealt with it, but because after the first day I did this, I said to myself, I need to put my polarizer on the lens when we get back to the car and leave it there. I need to remember to take it with me, and I forgot to do that in my haste. So the lesson I took away from this was that it's important to, for me at least, it's important to convert situations that start as I need to remember to, into a situation where whatever it was that I needed to remember becomes the default state, at least wherever possible. So what I ended up doing is I ended up putting the polarizer on my lens, leaving it there for the entire rest of the trip. In fact, I didn't take it off until I was unpacking back at home. Obviously, there could be some downsides specifically to leaving something like a polarizer on your lens if you are shooting like interiors in low light, night landscapes, etc. However, my counter argument to that is that it is easier to take a polarizer that's on your lens off in the situation where, say, you have differential polarization in the sky than it is to put it on if it's not physically in your possession. So what I ended up doing, as I said, is put the polarizer on my 24-70 2.8. It was my landscape lens for the trip, and I just left it there for the entire rest of the trip. So the other filter-related issue that I ran into was variable neutral density. Now, I knew going out that I was going to shoot video. That was part of the plan in my game plan for the trip. And I knew shooting video outside was going to require some level of neutral density filter to be optimal. Unfortunately, I kind of ran into two problems that are sort of, I think they're related to me, but obviously they could, other people could certainly have the problem. One is that I have a long background as a still photographer, and I've only been shooting videos seriously for the last 2 years, and almost all of that, thanks to the pandemic, has been shot in a studio environment doing these kinds of videos for YouTube. That means I have complete control of lighting. Now, in Yellowstone, or going to Yellowstone, I knew that I was going to need to have control over the light entering the camera other than or beyond just the aperture, shutter, and ISO. And so I did buy variable neutral density filters. They're probably the easiest way to manage, I think, a wide-ranging situation. So I bought the Polar Pro Peter McKinnon signature ones. But I mean, obviously, kind of any variable neutral density filters would certainly work. Unfortunately, that background as a still photographer and not a videographer would prompt me to jump out of the car, run and shoot a situation on the fly, and not actually think about grabbing filters or grabbing the variable neutral density filters, because it just isn't something I had to deal with as a photographer. The lesson I think to take away, or that I can take away from this, is kind of more challenging in some respects. I'm not exactly sure how to address this. My gut is that I need to train more. I need to spend more time shooting outside in, if not train, I need to just have more experience. There are certainly things that I could do to sort of organize or, have a vest or something to equip myself with the equipment so that I have it with me to, run and gun. I could also do what I did with the polarizer, which is leave the filter on the lens. That's a little bit, well, in this case, it was a little bit harder with the variable neutral density than the polarizers, but that's also a possible option too. But I don't have a good answer for that. One of the things that I identified on this trip is something that I'm considering, wasn't a problem, but it's something that I'm considering a potential for a problem, which is I find that I'm developing a much more significant reliance or over-reliance on image stabilization. Now, I mean, modern image stabilizer systems are incredibly powerful. On my R5 with a 24-70 f2.8, by all accounts, I should be able to get shake-free, and I do get generally shake-free images at shutter speeds that I can't actually keep the motion blur out of the image because I'm physically, the camera's compensating for the shake, but I'm physically moving further than the camera can deal with in a single image. Really impressive capabilities. However, in relying on image stabilization, I found that I also had to rely on other systems that aren't necessarily bad, but require giving up some control. So the biggest thing was subject detection AF. And I'll talk about the performance of subject detection AF on the R5 and R5C in the next video on the gear specifically, but by relying on subject detect AF to be able to box and track a subject so that I could, because of having the whole mechanics of having to hold the camera stable, I essentially gave up the fine control that I would have if I was using, say, spot AF. Now, in some cases, this wasn't a problem and everything worked fine. In other cases, due to the environmental situation, so intervening bushes or grass or something like that, the camera would end up focusing on the grass in front of, or the bush, the branches in front of the subject or bear in most cases that I was trying to photograph, and not on the subject that I was trying to photograph. Of course, this isn't a slight on the subject detect, because the subject detected it fine, but the camera can't know that grass isn't part of the thing that it's detecting, or it doesn't see it that way. The subject detection isn't that intelligent. So my takeaway from this is, as much as possible, keep using it. I need to keep using a tripod, especially for video. I've had very good luck actually shooting video handheld and getting very stable, or well, pretty stable shots, even for extended lengths, like minute, 2 minute sort of holds on something. But a tripod is definitely not an obsolete tool at this point in time. Another one that I could have been really bit by but wasn't, fortunately, was making major configuration changes, untested major configuration changes on the fly. So normally all of the video that I shoot is shot using the EOS neutral picture style. Whether it's on the R5C or the R5, I shoot EOS neutral. It allowed me to get pretty close to the image I wanted in camera without having to do a lot of work in post. Now, on this trip, what I ended up doing is, like, halfway through day one, going, you know, I should really try to get as much dynamic range in my video as I possibly can, and I switched to C-Log 3. Now, I am shooting in C-Log 3 basically all the time now, largely because some of the stuff that, some of the reasoning that I was using for shooting in EOS neutral kind of rendered itself moot. One of my thought processes was that it was close to what I wanted, so I didn't have to do a lot of color grading in post. It turned out that I was still doing color grading in post, and ultimately kind of created my own LUT to do the color grading that, or the base color grading that I wanted. And a lot of that thought process of, well, if I'm not using, if I can avoid, or if I'm using a LUT to do EOS neutral to the way I want to do it, then using a LUT to get C-Log 3 the way I want it, it's the same thing from a post-processing perspective. In any event, what changing, and while, like I said, it didn't bite me because I managed to do a good enough job getting the exposures right, but what bit me with changing from EOS neutral to C-Log 3 was a significant increase in anxiety when shooting video over whether or not I was actually going to get a good exposure. Not having had field time or test time shooting in C-Log 3, I wasn't confident in the performance of, you know, whether I was doing things correctly exposure-wise. So the lessons I took away from this were threefold, really. First of all, I need to really either make sure I test everything in field conditions that I might use before I go on a trip like this. Because obviously, if you're flying halfway across the country or halfway around the world and you're spending all this money to go somewhere, while some things are outside of your control, like the weather, you don't want to screw stuff up that's inside of your control, and not fully knowing how something will perform is definitely something that's inside of your control. The alternative to that is being more comfortable leaving something, leaving quote quality unquote on the table. So I knew what I was doing with EOS neutral. I knew how the picture should look. I knew how the exposures should be done. And I could have stayed with that and just left the expanded dynamic range and flatter picture style on the table for, you know, or the difference in image quality on the table, and just said, you know, I don't need to worry about having the better, the whatever's potentially better isn't going to be better enough that it's worth messing things up. Now, of course, as I said, for me at least, this shouldn't be a problem going forward. I have just switched everything over to shooting C-Log 3 and the Cinema Gamut as my standard workflow now. And this goes back to actually my very first point about changing Remember 2s into the default state. I have been shooting to system audio since basically I started shooting video. It is the default state. I don't think about it. I don't worry about it. I know how to set it up. It's second nature at this point. And that's what's I expect is gonna happen with C-Log 3 and Cinema Gamut, is by using it on a regular basis, and this really applies to anything, which is a great lesson in general. By using something on a regular basis, I will, as it being the default state, I will be completely comfortable operating in that mode. So one final thing I want to touch on, and then I'm going to wrap this up before it goes any further, is my Pano technique. I have a thing about shooting Panos. I hate shooting wide angle. For whatever reason, if I'm shooting a landscape that I know is going to be a narrow aspect ratio panorama, whether it's vertical or horizontal, it doesn't matter. I hate shooting with a wide angle lens, say a 30 or 15 millimeter, 18 millimeter, whatever, and then cropping out like half of the image data to get the aspect ratio I want. Now, I know with a 45 this certainly was the case with my 30 megapixel 5Ds. I know with my 45 megapixel R5s that I can do that and get decent prints, but for whatever reason, in my mind, the way I work, I am just far more comfortable with shooting that whole thing as a pano and getting close to the aspect ratio I want with a whole lot more information. So I tend to shoot landscapes as panos, and I tend to shoot them handheld. Might not be the best technique, but it is fast, and I have developed a technique for it that works well for me. Now, when I was on that in 2018, when I was in Yellowstone and the Tetons, and I was shooting panos, I had not fully developed that technique yet. I was still kind of trying some things, and I hadn't thought it through. Since then, I have very religiously and rigorously, when I am shooting panos handheld, adhered to the technique of shooting 2 to 3 frame bursts at each sub-image position. And this has the sort of twofold benefits of it forced me to stop. And the problem that I was having originally shooting panos is that I would pan and I would still be moving when I would hit the shutter release to take the picture, and then I would keep panning to the next frame. Obviously, recipe for motion blur. By stopping to shoot multiple frames, I forced myself into stopping and slowing down at each frame. And that has been something that's actually ingrained fairly well into me from a mechanics standpoint. I'm not doing kind of this thing. I'm doing shoot, 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 shoot. It's much more deliberate, and it took a while for that to really ingrain. Obviously, shooting in bursts at each stop also works if you're shooting HDR panos, because you have to shoot the HDR stack at each location as well. Now, this has absolutely, even though there was a lot of cases on this trip where I shot single frames in a Pano, this had the knock-on effect of making it me much more deliberate and having much better control over where I was shooting in each frame. So this worked, I found, really well for shooting handheld. Now, obviously, with anything going forward, I can't get sloppy. And that's really my only concern with this, is that moving forward, I decide to become that I'm good and I don't need to be as deliberate. And I'm not sure how long it's going to take to ensure that it's fully habitual, or if that's already the case, but that's something that I will be keeping an eye on in future situations and travel. So I'm going to wrap this up here at just under 45 minutes. I think that's plenty long enough to talk about the stuff that I identified that were sort of operational things. If you found this interesting, or at least a little entertaining, let me know by hitting that like button. If you this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. If you know somebody who might also find this useful, please consider sharing it with them. It helps them, it helps me, it helps make you look like the hero. It's a win all around, and just in general, a good thing. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.